please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Hello and welcome to the CNBC TV18 special. I'm Shereen Bhan. We've got plenty of news to talk about and, of course, continue to analyze the decisions taken by the government to help the rupee as well as control the current account deficit. I have a special guest with me, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Rathin Roy, will join me in just a bit. But first up, the big headline that's come in today from the government, from the banking space. The government now deciding to merge Dena Bank Vijaya Bank and Bank of Baroda to create the third largest bank in India after State Bank of India and ICICI Bank. This was a decision that was announced by the government today. What the boards of these individual banks will now do is clear the merger proposal. Today's announcement follows the merger announcement of SBI and its associate banks in 2017. Addressing the media earlier, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley stressed that the merger would be conceived in a way so as to ensure that the combined bank does not end up becoming weaker than the individual entities, also assuring that the proposed merger will not adversely impact employees of any of the banks. Let's listen in to the Finance Minister.
No employee will face a service condition which is anyway adverse in nature to his present service conditions. On the contrary, the SBI experience has been that amongst the merging and the entities and the new entity, the best of the service conditions continue to apply to all of them. So the employees of a relatively smaller bank, if at all, would get an opportunity to improve their working conditions.
The combined capital adequacy ratio is quite good. As far as Bank of Baroda is concerned, our capital adequacy ratio on CET1 is 9.24, something to that effect. Post the merger, it goes up. So in that sense, the CET ratio very, very marginally increased. What does it do to Bank of Baroda? It strengthens the position in Maharashtra. The consolidated entity is now stronger in Maharashtra, stronger in Gujarat, and for Bank of Baroda, in particular, there is a greater degree of strength in terms of branch presences in the 4 southern states. If I were just to take the loan book of Bank of Baroda to the combined loan book, I think it goes up by about 40%.
Okay, but, immediately, what are the synergies you see? Of course, the geographical print, you're more present in the south. The other 2 banks are more north-based, Gujarat-based. Do you anticipate some rationalization of branches? What will be the immediate synergies that come out with the merger?
Not immediately. First, we will take board's approval for deciding on further course of action.
You all have the same technology platform, I believe.
Yeah, we are in Fiscal.
So that's the big bank merger that was announced by the government. Boards will now meet to officially clear the amalgamation proposal, but that is a formality. In a sense, the government has now decided to move ahead. The markets will respond to this proposed transaction only tomorrow. Remember, the news came in after the markets had closed for the day. But let's now focus our attention on the rupee. The volatility for the currency continued even today, despite the measures that were announced by the government on the weekend. Now, let's just take a look at what happened in the currency market. Not just the rupee, but all emerging currency markets were under pressure today. And the significant pressure points for us back home: appetite from importers at low points. The government was seen to be alert when the announcement with the rupee hit 72.70. Bonds were also sulking despite open market purchases by the Reserve Bank. Meanwhile, in a bid to stem the fall in the rupee, the government has constituted a task force to look at import substitutions across 5 sectors. This is a cabinet secretary-led panel that will examine imports in defense, electronics, telecom, metals, petroleum, and the solar sector. The task force will analyze if domestic capacity exists for import substitution and identify constraints increasing capacity. The panel has had informal discussions with corporate India on the substitution issue, and we spoke with a whole host of experts to find out what they make of the rupee's depreciation against the dollar after the government's intervention over the weekend. This is what they had to say.
definitely we are part of an emerging market care or fall, or so to say. But at the same time, we do have our own issues, which is the current account deficit. Based on whatever measures which have been announced by the government, I would still say, since the action was a little underwhelming, maybe 72 to 72.60, 72.65 kind of range for the day. Range for the 3 months, I would presume, is more, could be in the region of 71.5 to 72.5 to 73, depending upon how EM currency stabilizes.
Market expectations of the measures had probably were too bullish. People were expecting a lot, which was probably not warranted at this point, and that is why there was a little bit of disappointment with the measures that were actually announced. In addition, there was also news that Trump is still going to go ahead with the $200 billion of tariffs on imports from China, despite the talks, news of talks earlier in the week. So I think combination of those factors, clearly Rupee is likely to be under pressure as a result of that.
Well, that's opinion coming in on the volatility that we continue to see with the rupee. But joining us now is Rathin Roy, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, also at the NIPFB. Appreciate you joining us here on the program. Let me start by asking you about what you made of today's development before I talk to you about what you made of the developments over the weekend. It has taken the street by surprise, even though it has been a stated objective in the government's budget this year that they intend to consolidate even within the banking space. But this decision to go ahead and merge Dena Bank, Vijaya Bank and Bank of Baroda certainly taking people by surprise. I mean, you know, Bank of Baroda may have made a reasonable amount of progress in its cleaning up act, but the same cannot be said, for instance, of Dena Bank. So what do you make of this development and the timing?
I make nothing of it, Shereen, simply because I'm not an expert on banking. This is not an economics question. It's a management and restructuring question, and I simply do not have the domain knowledge to comment on it.
Okay, fair point. So let me then talk to you about the measures that were announced over the weekend, largely to do with the capital account and proposed measures to deal with the current account. Now, the manner in which the rupee has reacted today gives you a sense that, as most commentators have expressed, the measures announced over the weekend were on the underwhelming side. Do you believe that so far what we've seen from the government isn't really going to curb the volatility in the currency market?
All right. First, let me say that there is no volatility in the currency markets. What you're seeing is a decline in a depreciation across all emerging markets. And if you look at India, it is remarkable that while there is a depreciation, there is very limited volatility. If you look at what happened with the yuan, for instance, today, the renminbi, that is what I would call volatility. So we've had this for two reasons, as one of the commentators was saying earlier. The emerging market investors have algorithms. Those algorithms respond to many things. One of the most important things to respond to is what the US does and what China does. The reiteration that the US will impose $200 billion tariffs on China and the reaction of the Chinese yuan has led to two things. One, the indubitable realization that there will be opportunities to put money into the US in the short term, which are profit-making and credible, and that would naturally mean there'll be less money to put into emerging markets. Second, the fact that the Chinese currency reacted in a volatile fashion would then mean that they would be more cautious in what they put into emerging markets, so there would be some withdrawal from emerging markets, and that is reflected in the depreciation. Right. That being said, it is not what I would call a sort of shock depreciation, right? It's in paise, and therefore in sense it is rather small. The government's announcements over the weekend, I think, did two things. One, it showed, to quote Charles Dickens, that Buckis is willing, in the sense that let nobody be under any misapprehension that, one, the government will make sure that it deploys all resources it has under its control if someone in these circumstances tries to short the rupee. And two, there is no holy cow or bull or pig or other animal in our policy which would inhibit the government from taking steps, including taking a good hard look at what can be done with respect to import substitution. And so what the government has done is offered some carrots on the left-hand side in terms of attracting foreign resources in, and that's a short to medium-term measure. It's also signaled its willingness to take the bull by the horns and actively look at import substitution in the medium term, which sends a positive signal, which I welcome. I would like to make one caveat. Import substitution does not mean import controls. There's a range of options before government, and that those options can be exercised only in consultation with the private sector on what we can do to reduce our dependence on imports in the 5 key areas that the government highlighted according to your report. And what the government has said is it means business, and it started work on this matter, which is excellent, better late than never.
Okay, so I'll come to the import substitution policy that is currently being looked at by a panel headed by the Cabinet Secretary in just a bit. But I want to continue with the measures announced as far as the rupee is concerned. Again, expectation in the market that the Reserve Bank will act as and when appropriate. What is it that you expect now? And I want to ask the question on monetary policy because, there are people that believe that an interest rate hike is now inevitable. Of course, an interest rate hike may not necessarily be used as an instrument to combat the depreciation as far as rupee is concerned. So what's the take on what you expect from the Reserve Bank?
I expect the Reserve Bank to do its job through the Monetary Policy Committee, take a call on what is going to drive inflation going forward over the next 2 or 3 quarters. There are many factors that could drive inflation, and one of them could be external account factors. For instance, a rise in the price of oil, inelastic demand, and therefore a transmission effect into inflation. What I do not expect the Reserve Bank to do, and I'm confident they will not do it, is act on a potential component of inflation. So what I expect the Reserve Bank to do is that if current external account events feed into inflationary expectations, then I expect them to take action. Otherwise, I do not. And that is why the Reserve Bank Monetary Policy Committee meets 5 times a year. So knee-jerk reactions I do not expect. I don't think they're on the cards. I think the Reserve Bank will take a view on domestic and external factors that may impact inflation going forward, and then take a decision on what to do with the instrument in the disposal, the interest rate, to keep inflation within the agreed policy band.
So no knee-jerk reaction, that's your expectation from the Reserve Bank. You spoke of imports, and that's an idea that you welcome, that import substitution should be looked at by the government in earnest. But what about export incentivization? I think, and I spoke with a whole host of people, and the consensus was that not enough has been done to actually push the cause of exports in the last few years. And that must be now done on a war footing. So as we look at the issue of import substitution, what about export incentivization, which again, the government has expressed its intent to do?
As a public economist, I can't help using this analogy. If we talk about raising taxes, other than raising tax rates, that depends on a host of factors. When we talk about cutting expenditure, it is well within government's control. So if we have a current account deficit that is causing problems, then what the government can do in the immediate term is look at ways in which to reduce imports, and importantly, that involves in some way or the other import substitution. With exports, the only short-term thing you can do is incentivize them in price terms. And the best incentive then for exports is depreciation. However, we know from the literature and from lessons past that Indian exports respond more to changes in world demand and to changes in domestic productivity than to price depreciation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a problem. The rupee is depreciating, exports would rise, imports would fall. But that is not happening because the elasticities don't work that way. Therefore, the application of incentives to exports is not going to have even a sort of annual term effect on exports. Of course, we need to increase exports, but that involves looking at productivity and at looking at world market demand conditions. However, I think many things can be done to promote a slower growth rate in imports, including sort of import substitution measures. And so the government has quite sensibly decided to focus on those. So the key takeaway here is incentives mean affecting prices, but exports do not respond to prices, and therefore the scope for those measures, in my view, in the short to medium term is limited.
Okay, I want to talk about imports because you said that the government is not thinking about controls, but it's thinking about substitution. As our report said, that a panel has been set up headed by the Cabinet Secretary, and it's looking at about 5 areas or 5 sectors at this point in time. But, isn't that going to play out in the medium to long term and not necessarily in the short to immediate term?
Well, that is what the panel has got to find out. I'm not on the panel, but if I were to depose before it, I would say that there are certain immediate areas where we can actually mute at least the growth of imports essentially by making sure that we shift the pattern of our consumption demand into areas where the consumption of all Indians is affected, and the consumption of Indians of certain things, such as, for example, luxury electronics, is discouraged. I think their price signals would work in short to medium term. It's not as if I'm against food imports, but hey, people are importing iPhones. I need to take a look at what I can do to discourage them from importing iPhones, right? And if I can do that across a spectrum of areas, even if there's a relatively small inframarginal impact in the short run, it does two things. That small inframarginal impact sends a signal saying that the government is now saying for the first time it is very serious about import substitution. This is not some fudge like Make in India, Make for India. They're saying directly, we have appointed a committee under the highest civil servant in the land to look at measures for import substitution. There will be short-term measures. These will cascade into medium-term measures. And if that works, then I think we will actually have brought the balance of payments under control without compromising on important things like essential consumption and capital goods.
Yeah,
and other
but
stuff
the immediate term would mean price action. It would mean a higher tariff, wouldn't it?
That is one of the things you could do, impose a higher tariff. The other thing you could do is examine whether the kinds of market conditions that exist for luxury imports to thrive and to discount may be muted. My own personal opinion is we need to take a good hard look at the aviation sector. For example, I'm sticking my neck out here, and ask whether it is a national priority that passenger aviation grows at the rate that it grows. And the number of price actions you could take there, number of sort of incentive or disincentive actions you could take there. There's a whole spectrum of them you could do. And I hope, I'm not in the committee, that the committee will be pragmatic in this fashion and look at things sector by sector and ask who's doing the importing. And having done that, either send out signals that such importing will not be actively encouraged and where possible discouraged without going into extreme steps like quantitative controls. We're beyond that now. And I'm confident that there is ample scope for this to happen in small measure to begin with, but with a cascading effect in the medium term. This is definitely an important nationalist change in policy, which I welcome.
Okay, you welcome this policy, though this is up for debate. The former Commerce Secretary Rahul Kullar, the former RBI Deputy Governor Rakesh Mohan were on my program, and the former Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha just yesterday saying that they think that this is not a good idea at this point in time. So you wouldn't agree with that?
The past is no guide for the future. And the three entities you mentioned have worked in the past, and they have great expertise, but the past is no guide to the future.
Okay, since we're talking about the current account deficit, let me also now get you to focus on the fiscal deficit. The government came out and said that they're very confident of being able to maintain the 3.3% fiscal deficit target. But the worry is that can you really make up on the direct taxes front what the shortfall is on the indirect tax front? GST collections, by all accounts, short at least 10,000 crores every month. Are you concerned not just about the current account, but also the fiscal deficit at this point?
I would have been very concerned if the government was anything less than totally unambivalent that the fiscal deficit target will be respected. I am also confident that any shortfalls that you may see on the indirect tax front will be compensated on the direct tax front. There's enough cushion there. I'd like to point out to your viewers that I said this at the time of the budget, that the government was extremely conservative in terms of percentage of GDP in projecting increases in the direct tax GDP ratio. Therefore, I genuinely believe there's some elbow room there. With GST, I continue to believe the jury is still out. It is likely, though by no means certain, that the target will not be met. I could be wrong. There's a long time to go. But the magnitude of that shortfall, I do not think will be of an order that cannot be managed by countervailing revenue gains.
Okay. Okay, so that's what you hope will meet the deficit on the indirect tax side as well, as and when the government decides to go down that route. But let me end then by asking you, what would you be most concerned about?
And what I want to say very clearly is that nothing is happening today.
Yes. Go ahead.
nothing that is happening today merits using any sort of event that is happening today to argue for the government not to strictly adhere to its fiscal deficit target. Nothing happening today or in the foreseeable future warrants such an argument. And I sincerely hope that when the pre-budget discussions happen, this will not be used to put further pressure on the finance minister to relax his target, as the private sector has regrettably done many years now. It is irresponsible and this must stop.
Absolutely, and it shouldn't be an election budget, it should be a reasoned budget. That's the consensus in the community that we speak with as well. But Rathin, I'll end by asking you, in order of priority, the challenges on the macro front, and in order of priority, the action that you would like to see.
Challenges on the macro front, number one, stick with the policy framework you have framed. You have framed a policy framework where you have set out a clear roadmap for keeping the fiscal deficit under control. Stick to it. You have set out a policy framework where we have declared our intention to keep inflation within a quantitative target, and whether you agree with the analytical framework or not, there's a monetary policy committee that uses the instrument available to it, the interest rate, to deal with inflation. Do not mix up aims and means by using that instrument for something else. On the exchange rate front, I think it is salutary in the medium term that we have finally recognized that our current account deficit is structural and therefore needs structural measures, and there must be no no-go areas based on past neoliberal or any other kind of thinking. Everything is open for discussion. We will be conservative and cautious, I hope, in the decisions we take, but that does not mean we will not be courageous. And I'm quite sort of fortified by recent announcements that the government is not afraid to be courageous in signaling its intent to tackle this problem. Whether we are able to tackle this problem effectively depends on more than government, it depends on industry, other stakeholders, but that is definitely the big challenge ahead that we need to do. In an increasingly uncertain and volatile environment, we have to bring the current account deficit under control. Yep. That means we have to moderate import growth, we have to moderate luxury import growth, and we have to do what we can other than pricing to improve productivity and address world global demand to both diversify and increase the rate of export growth.
We'll have to leave it there. Rathin Roy, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV18 with your thoughts on the measures announced and the road ahead. Appreciate your time. With that, it is time for us to wrap up this CNBC TV18 special. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment with India Business Hour.